Today, we are going to discuss what real worship looks like from a biblical perspective. To begin, it's important to acknowledge that Scripture never provides anything that resembles a clear definition of what worship is, nor is there a comprehensive list of the things which constitute worship provided anywhere in Scripture. Instead, we are given clues and throughout the biblical texts which illuminate an incomplete but robust understanding of what right worship is supposed to look like. The tendency for the church, especially the Western church, is to define or limit worship to the expressions used. We reduced worship to something you do, and that is unfortunately a weak understanding of biblical worship. Instead, like an example would be that if I asked you to define the word art and you said, well, it's painting or it's sculpting, and those would be accurate, but it's more than just doing something. Like there is an imaginative creativity, like there is a picture that an artist thinks up, there are color choices, and there are things that evoke emotions. And it's not just the act of painting or sculpting, but it is the holistic process which makes something art, like the difference between art and decoration. And so worship is the same way. There are many may define worship as singing or part of the church service which comes before the sermon. And those may be correct expressions of worship, but they are not worship in the totality. There's a difference between just singing and worship. If you've been around AFA long enough, you've heard it described that we worship through our tithes, through our giving, through our offering, through the trusting in acts of surrender to God. And those things can absolutely be acts of worship. But worship is not only our tithes and giving. There's a difference between worshiping and donating to charity. So worship isn't really something you do at all. It's a heart posture. It's the status of your heart which is lived out in the totality of our life in every aspect. The InterVarsity Press's Dictionary of Paul and his letters says this: formal definition of what worship of God means or entails in the Bible. In biblical literature, it can be safely said that in both testaments, worship originates in the understanding of God as Creator and Redeemer. In the InterVarsity Press's Dictionary of the Old Testament Prophets, it says that true worship involves reverential acts of surrender before the divine sovereign, in response to his gracious revelation of himself according to his will. And so worship is recognizing and acknowledging the place and role of God in your life and in God in all creation, and then living in a way which reflects that. So simply put, anything you do which comes from a right understanding of God's sovereign reign and his divine love and sacrifice and redemption is worship. This can be singing about how marvelous God is. This can be praying to God. This can be surrendering your finances in trust to God through tithing or offerings. This can be loving your neighbor. This can be enjoying God's creation. However, the caution is that worship is about the heart posture, not the act. Worship is not a religious act. Religious acts can be acts of worship, but in and of themselves, they are not worship. We must be very cautious not to relate worship to something we do. The ancient Israelites and Judahites did exactly this, and they convinced themselves that they were providing good and right worship to God because they did the right things, because they kept the right worship feasts and sacrifices. And in their misguidedness, God sent prophets to declare what worship really is. If we look at Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, the Israelites ask God, what are we supposed to come before you with? What should we give you that would be good worship? Should we offer immense sacrifices of rams or calves or burnt offerings or floods of oil? Like they presented God with this question: what act of sacrifice or of worship will please you? They even said, shall I give my own firstborn to you? Will that be something that satisfies you, God? And his response in verse 8 is, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. We also see in Amos chapter 5 that God says, like, even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. I won't accept your acts of worship, right? God despised their sacrifices. He wouldn't look on them. He says in verse 23, take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In the book of Hosea, chapter 6, verse 6, God says, For I desire steadfast love or mercy and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Jesus quotes this passage from Hosea when he confronts the Pharisees about their worship practices that weren't actually worship unto God. So worship isn't about singing or tithing or church attendance or going to Sunday school or going on mission trips or having a cross sticker on your car or wearing a cross necklace, right? Those may be expressions of worship, but worship is about the heart behind those actions. Worship is about rightly loving God by rightly loving ourselves and our neighbors. Like from the prophets, we see that right worship that is pleasing to God permeates all that we do. And if we claim to have a worship heart posture, but we fail to demonstrate mercy, or if we lack the knowledge of God, or we fail to walk in humility, or if we act unjustly, or if we support unjust systems, then our heart posture, our true heart posture, is betrayed. Like, I cannot hope to have a mature worship heart posture and not fight for justice. I cannot hope to have a mature worship heart posture and embody unkindness or embody arrogance and pride. And so in summary, first, worship is not something that you do. It is a holistic and comprehensive way of being. Next, worship is anything that stems from a right acknowledgement and a correct understanding of God's redemptive sovereignty and love. Next, worship isn't just acts, but it requires that the totality of our life is directed toward loving God by loving neighbor and loving ourselves. Be blessed.